Since the 20th century, ships, both military and civilian, have always been associated with steel, but something people often don't know is that there were concrete ships, and not just a couple. Dozens and hundreds of these have sailed the seas, both in times of peace and in times of war. One of the countries that took the most advantage of this curious material to make ships was the United States, which even built an entire fleet of concrete military ships. But how is it possible that a material as heavy and brittle as concrete could be used to make ships? What benefits did it bring, and why did they disappear both from the world and from our memories? In this video, we'll discuss the history of concrete ships. Get comfortable, I'm Kevin Aguilar, and this is Guns Club. World War I, like no other war before, required an enormous industrial effort to meet all the needs of the conflict. In the naval field at that time, metals were the main material used for building ships. However, in general, they were becoming increasingly expensive and scarce due to their enormous demand in other areas, so the huge production costs pushed Americans to explore other alternatives for shipbuilding. For several years, concrete had been used to build barges in several other nations in a limited way. Therefore, the use of this material to build warships was seriously considered. Likewise, in 1917 and the following year, many reinforced concrete ships began to be produced for carrying supplies. The project was viewed with a lot of skepticism at first, until 1918. A German spy was caught trying to steal blueprints of these concrete ships, which increased the credibility of the project. More than a dozen of these were built, but since most of them were finished after the war, they were sold to different private companies that used them for various purposes. Among all these ships, the SS Palo Alto and the SS Selma stand out. They were huge oil tankers and were used for more than 50 years. These ships were quite large, reaching up to 132 meters in length, which is 40 meters longer than the Statue of Liberty. After these successes, the technology would be copied by other nations, such as in Norway, where the first concrete ocean-going ship, the nascent Fjord, was built, measuring 25 meters long. Similarly, many of these were built during the interwar period, before the start of World War I in the United States. Ordered more ships of this type at first, 24 of them to be exact. These were intended to transport logistics and were 111 meters long, and interestingly, they were steam-powered. Improvements in concrete allowed them to have a stronger and thinner hull, so they were lighter. In addition, 78 unpowered concrete barges were built, intended to be towed. All these ships and barges carried supplies such as oil, minerals, weapons, and even soldiers, leaving steel, a very valuable material during the war, for the construction of other ships. Whether they would see frontline combat on the day, they were key for transporting supplies, from tank spare parts to floating bridges. They were also used to be deliberately sunk to block the passage of other enemy ships. The Germans, of course, would not be left behind, manufacturing 50 ships of this type for the final stages of the conflict, all dedicated to transport. In the same way, and in fact many of these have been restored up to this day and are being used as museums and restaurants. In fact, a concrete company from California proposed a submarine-shaped freighter that, according to them, could reach speeds of 75 knots. However, when the war ended, research on this type of ship ceased completely, and of course so did the manufacturing of all of them. In total, between the British and the Americans, nearly 400 of these ships were built, almost outnumbering the combined submarine fleets of both countries. But why this particular material? Well, as we already mentioned, making them out of cement made them extremely cheap. Additionally, they were extremely resistant and could withstand impacts from icebergs and even projectiles much better than steel ships. Additionally, they were immune to corrosion and you could easily repair them with resins or more cement. Also, a good feature of these was that they responded very slowly to temperature changes, making them perfect for transporting perishable or flammable goods. But probably the most important factor, which even explains how their numbers skyrocketed during the wars, has to do with the shipyards. The shipyards for building steel ships were complex, and there were only a limited number of them. and they were operating at maximum production capacity during the war. In contrast, the shipyards for making concrete ships were extremely simple to build, with little machinery and fewer industrial processes, so they could build as many shipyards of this type as they needed. And of course, in a very short time, the labor needed to build these ships was really low and not very specialized. With 5 bricklayers, cement, Cruz Azul, and caguamas, you could build a ship. I'm joking, but you really didn't need many welders or engineers to make them back then. Skilled labor with formal education wasn't as common as it is now, so this valuable resource at the time could be allocated to places where it was much more needed. You probably think it wasn't possible for these to exist, since they were too heavy to float. But can any object really float? As long as it follows Archimedes' principle, the ship must not weigh more than the water it displaces. As long as it stays within that limit, it can float. And concrete ships could do it. However, these were considerably much heavier than conventional ships. These were reinforced with steel rods. However, to be viable, they had to be 10 times thicker than metal ships. And although concrete is less dense than metal, concrete ships weighed almost twice, or sometimes even 3 times as much as steel ships of similar size. These, having a greater volume and weight, displaced much more water and were very slow, so they used a lot of fuel to move. In addition, since these were so heavy and had much less space inside to carry cargo, they could only carry about half the load of a steel ship. During the war, they were much cheaper to make because steel was very expensive due to its high demand. After the war, steel prices dropped. So the production costs of both types of ships were similar. So it didn't make sense to build concrete ships if they cost the same as steel ones. And besides, were conventional shipyards already available? So because of all these factors, concrete ships never sailed the seas again. Most of these became too expensive to operate after the war because of high fuel prices, and they were sunk off the coast to be used as breakwaters. Many others had more curious fates, like the United States ship San Pascual, which was given to Cuba in the 1930s, and it was used to transport cargo. And it was even armed during World War I to protect itself from submarines, and even used as a prison by Che Guevara and his troops. Later, it became a fishing sports club and finally a hotel in the 90s, only to end up abandoned nowadays. Of course, since it's made of concrete, today it's practically intact, so the story of these ships still seems to have no end. If you found this video interesting, you might also want to know the story of the American battleship that neither the Japanese Empire nor the United States itself, its manufacturer, could sink. I highly recommend it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.